Okay, anyway. All right. Hello, everyone. I'm in my old-fashioned farming rocking chair. Since this is so long, I'm just gonna uh, kind of just talk about it briefly. So, I had an independent study that I did in my last year at Hope College. I think it was like 2002. Yeah. So I had to interview Centennial Farm. Well, my idea was to create a photography where I would interview Centennial farmers. You see, when I was growing up, I think this has always been occurring. But when I was growing up, there was several farmers in my class, in my that I knew, kids my age. So you would always hear them. Many of them were always talking about how down and out farming was. There were some big farms, but there was they were my friends. So you kind of just you feel for them, and I saw a lot of farm cell growing up, and so I basically it was part of the reason why I became so interested in like protecting the environment. It was just the farmers would sell their property. When you're growing up, farming is this very wholesome thing. It's a good earth. It's like the good earth, and farmers are the farmers are sung about in songs. They just represent this very good thing. So when anything bad happens to farmers or farming, it's something that you learn about, and it's upsetting. So and then I also grew up in a very I almost feel like I'd like my generation. I'm in this weird generation because I experienced both cell phones. Like when I grew up, we had three TV stations my whole life. We never had cable TV. We never had an answering machine. I didn't have a cell phone or an answering machine until I was a freshman in college, and then I had it all. Um, I had all three of those things, and then I had a laptop. So 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 I remember what it was like to have like very simple, basic ways of communicating and doing things, and then then the internet, of course, happened, and computers happened in the mid to late '90s, and it all happened at once. The stock market boomed up. It all went crazy. Basically, we were living it at the time, so it didn't seem that crazy. But looking back and thinking about how much everything changed, my grandpa's house on Glen Lake, over in Leelanau County, where a lot of these farmers that I interviewed live. Um, he died in 1993. His property sold for like $300,000 or something. 100-foot lot with a nice house on Glen Lake. By like 1997, that property was worth like $1 million. So like the property tripled in 4 years, kind of. So it was I was in the middle of all that, watching this happen. Now when the older you get, the faster time seems to go, because when you're only like 1 or 2 or 3, 4, 5, 6 years old, your life is only five years long. So 5 years is a lifetime. Now 5 years is nothing, because I'm 40, so 5 years is an eighth of my life. So time starts seeming like it's going faster because we've had more time to live. So to compare it to. So back in high school when I was a senior, I really cared about where I lived, and like I said in some other videos, I was watching roads becoming paved over that used to be nice old dirt roads. I was seeing farms sell, lots of changes, large, mansions built all over Lake Michigan, just really booming times. Everyone's going to college. It's just, so I was, I was upset because I was, the farmhouse that my parents bought growing up was only, I think it cost them like $30,000 or something. Like 2 acres in a farmhouse, big old farmhouse. That's in like 1977, and now it's like worth over 10 times that. So I was starting to thinking about how I was ever going to be able to live in Leelanau County, which is where I grew up, and it was upsetting, and a part of me got kind of depressed, maybe kind of angry, Taylor Swift sings in one of her songs. She goes, well, that we had to learn living in a small town. She said she had to learn that what isn't real. What isn't real. So it makes me think about wanting to be a lawyer. I started thinking about ways I was going to be able to live in Leelanau County. So, one of my mentors was a neighbor who was a lawyer, and he was a politician, ran for office, didn't win, but he was just a general kind of, character of the community, respected character of the community who moved up to Leelanau County after living in Detroit. So he was a mentor of mine. He was a lawyer. He could do it. I thought I could do it being a lawyer. But I made all these decisions when I was in college, in the middle of trying to figure out what I should be doing, playing basketball or studying or both, or how this was all going to work. So I finally was about ready to graduate, and I decided to do an independent study. And it was on Centennial Farmers in Leelanau County. Again, farmers are always respected. In Michigan, we have this special program where if your farm has been an active farm run by the same family for over 100 years, you can apply to be a Centennial Farm, and then you get a nice plaque outside of your house, and it's a special recognition. And you see these, and so I always respected these farmers. I think a lot of that comes from my mom, my grandma living on farms. My grandma, whose house this was, living on a farm. So I had this idea that I was going to interview Centennial farmers and ask them about what the future of farming was going to be. And I was just an idealistic, student in academia, So, idealist, thinking I've achieved something because I graduated from college, So, but still, that's just what everyone has to do. So I moved back home, back here to Leelanau County, and I, proposed this project while I was down at Hope College. I proposed this project to my political science advisor, and he gave me the clearance to do it. I contacted the Leelanau Conservancy here. They gave me the clearance to do it, or they could kind of guide me, basically, is what it was, if I needed any guidance. So I met with them a couple times, and then I was on my own, with my camera and my tape recorder, and I strategized, and I kind of picked several Centennial farms all over Michigan, all over Leelanau County, that I was going to interview. And I started with one of them that was not too far from my house. It was the Korson farm. Peter Korson, World War II veteran. That's a picture I took of him holding his medals from the war. He was the first farmer I interviewed. So I went up to his house about, about 3 or 4 miles from my house, and just knocked on his door and told him what my idea was, and we set up a time, and I came back, and I interviewed him. And I sat down and recorded the whole interview. So I interviewed him for about roughly 3 hours. That's how long I interviewed him for. And I had it all recorded, and then I transcribed all the interviews. Took several pictures of his farm, and I began, putting these all this together. Let me see if I can find the beginning of this. I won't read all of this, but I'll read some of it. And it was a huge project. And at the time, I was really excited, thinking I was going to have this would turn into a book. Should have this ready, yeah. Okay. Oh, here we go. Almost there. So Peter Korson was he called himself a Czech or bohunk. I hope bohunk isn't derogatory, because bohunk is a Czechoslovakian, but that's what he called himself. So excuse me if that's not proper. Almost got it. And he lived on the original homestead that his father, his great grandfather homesteaded. Oh. Aha. I might just start off here. It's all right here. Jeez. There we go. Okay, I have enough here to start. I'm just going to read this for maybe 5 or 10 minutes, and then we'll just call that good. Now I'll just keep reading these every once in a while until we get them all done. So this was like the cover of my proposed book. That was a photo I took. The barn, and there's Peter Korson with his medals. I took that picture in front of his house. So this is the interview. So Peter starts off the interview. Peter starts off the interview. How was my grandfather, with only a third grade education, able to figure that all out? Peter was in disbelief over his grandfather's ability to build the barn that is still standing on the Korson farm. According to Peter, his barn, which is over 100 years old, stands as sturdy as the day it was completed. Then I go, you found something about that in here? I was flipping through a magazine Peter handed to me. So Peter's handing me a magazine. So this interview, I'm reading it to you because he's talking to me and stuff's going on, but it's all tape recorded. Yeah, it has how a barn is built, how the timbers are cut and stuff. It's a nice article, even though the barn on his farm is built different than the barn in the magazine. but it gives you some idea about where. And then I go, ever since you showed me, I have been looking at the joints in my barn and my neighbor's barns. A week earlier, Peter had given me a tour of his farm. One stop on his tour was the barn. While in the barn, Peter pointed out several joints where the main support beams were wedged together. Over 100 years had passed, and the joints are all still tight. Peter, to see if they wiggle. And here, it even mentions that you should build it with green timbers, which I am surprised. Really? I said. Peter, it must be that it's easier to hew the green ones than the dry ones. Leif, now what does hew mean? Hew means to chop into it, to square it up. But it had to be a bitch to drill. I wanted to build a model of this barn and have yet to figure out how they framed it. This barn does not have this cut at an angle, comparing his barn with the barn in the picture in the farming magazine. They cut it square up. It all sits on the tenant and this bottom. These braces are cut just like that. They have this tenant in there, even though they did not on this barn put this peg in. You don't need to. You have to have this ready to fit in. See? These two pegs will keep it at its location. They can't jump out. So he's describing to me how this barn was built, and his mind is just flying a mile a minute. And he's an engineer in his head about how they built this barn, and I'm kind of listening to him, kind of trying to understand it, but I kind of get what he's saying. This is the summary of the following two paragraphs. These paragraphs contain descriptions pertaining to barn design. These descriptions may be difficult to visualize since Peter used sketches to talk through his descriptions. This summary attempts to clarify these descriptions. The main support beams or braces located below the roof of Peter's barn are each full-length timbers. Peter's beams are 60 feet long. It is very rare to find a full-length timber this long. Most of the support braces that are found in longer barns, like Peter's brother's barn, are not made from full-length timbers. Rather, two beams would be spliced together to make one larger beam. According to Peter, this was not a simple operation, and joint creates a weak point in a barn, and joints create a weak point in a barn's central support structure. Here is what I was marveling. Now I'm back to the interview. Here is what I was marveling at when I was showing you this here barn. A barn is over 100 years old and still as structurally sound as the day they put the finishing touches on. Yet next door, speaking of his brother's barn, the barn is built out of hardwood. Shucks, you could move them 2 inches in that brace. Over time, hardwood shrinks at a faster rate than most conifers. Peter goes on and says, this was caused by either how much they dried out or they could have been loose when they were put in. You don't know if you weren't there. You see, they could have been cut just a fuzz short. The barn could have been leaning just a little bit, and while trying to put it in, they just cut it off to loosen that end and tighten on this end. But that barn over there has 2 of these. They had to go 74 feet. That barn is 40 by 74. By the time it was built in the 1930s, it was hard to find timber 60 feet long or longer. During the lumber boom, all the large trees that could be used as full-length beams were forested. Peter goes on and says, so they took 236s, see? Well, in order to hold, you can't just bump them together. They made this kind of a splice. You see, that notch fits into this notch, and those pegs keep it in location. You wonder how you can lift that 74 feet up there without it falling apart. But they do it. They lift it by hand first, then they get pike poles underneath. And with pike poles, they lift it into they lift it to go in the right location. Now, how no one got killed, I'll be damned. In all the barns that Dad talked about, I never heard him say that someone broke an arm or someone got killed. Then I say, while building them? Yes, Peter, you know that is yes, because you know that is mighty heavy. Even here, Peter's barn, at 60 feet, where you have a little better chance. Because when you lift this end, the whole thing is going up. The whole beam goes up because it's one continuous piece, not jointed. Peter goes on to say, you know, but if you splice it, you got to have this. Then Peter is pointing to a diagram in his magazine. You might be able to put this half in first and set this half in while it's up there. When lifting a beam that is made from two pieces rather than one, you have a greater chance for the beam to break apart when it's lifted. It is, now Peter goes on to say, it is a possibility. Now what they did over there, his brother's barn, because a beam broke when they were part way up, is that they put up this piece and this piece. Sometimes you cut it at an angle to put it in this piece here. Sometimes you cut it at an angle to put in this piece here so that it was easier to put it up there. This and then this. Then you had to send a nigger up there and he puts his peg in. Pegs that would hold the beams together. Now I'm going to say one thing here. He says you send a nigger up there. Now you might be like, oh my God. He was actually calling, he was calling anyone that word. He was just saying he was using that word to, I'm not justifying him saying it, but he actually was saying it in a way to, he was saying it so that there is no negative connotation to it. He could have called that person anything. So he was saying it, you know, he was saying it from the stance that a white person was going to go up there. So I don't know. You can call it what you want, but I know that that's what he meant. So this guy is a church. I don't even need to describe him. Those days they had monkeys that I can name the people, like Joe Sedlak, Henry Sedlak, Dad, Wenzel Kelchik. They walked right up there, they walked right up them beams. Now, he's talking about monkeys because they walked beams unlike anyone else could, like they were monkeys. This farmer was a character. They're all characters. They would stand up right up there and look at you. They're just monkeys that feel safe up there, see? You have to feel safe or you are shaken to pieces. But I just wanted to show you. It gives you some idea of how a barn is cut before it is put together. Then I go, I would like to start with, okay, the conversation is changing right now. Then I say to Peter, I would like to start with the general history of the farm, the people from the beginning. How did they manage to find this particular spot in Leelanau County? Well, Peter starts to answer my question. Well, as far back as I can go, Pat Hawkins. Now, Hawkins lived across the road. He homesteaded 160 acres, which was a regular homestead. Everyone was able to get a quarter section. That was what they called a quarter section, 160 acres. And then I go, for how much money? Peter responds, free. All you had to do was go to Leland and register it in your name. And then I go, and make improvements on it, right? Then Peter goes, well, you had to live on it for 5 years. And like you say, you had a little shack, a railroad track. Literally, it was not a railroad track. It was not a railroad track, but a driveway or weathered trail. So he has ways of describing things, Peter does, that are his own little figurative ways of describing things, which is interesting. And you would probably clear a little path, but most of them just cleared it and moved down it. When they say cleared it, that means they just cut all the trees down, sold it for lumber, cleared it and moved down it. Like around 1955 in Traverse City, or 1855 in Traverse City. That is why you have a lot of state land. It was poor farmland. They just slaughtered the timber and just moved on. On the subject of lumbering, I got this book. Peter slams the book on the table. When they cut pines down and left all those tops, the tops of the trees, in terms of all the unused branches that are littered throughout the forest after they lumber it. Peter goes on to say, little fine stuff was left around. Michigan had all these fires like they had in the West because of all this dry stuff laying on the ground. When they say Michigan on fire, and that was the title of the book that Peter was showing me, you might think that the entire state was on fire at once, right? But it wasn't. You'd have a big fire in Traverse City area. You might have a big fire in the Manistee area. And a year later, you might have a fire in Honor. So finally, it burnt the whole darn state, but it wasn't burning all at once. And then, because of the railroad, you know, that they had sparks flying out of the chimneys and whatever. And then I go on to say, 1871, looking at the date in the book, Michigan on Fire, the book that Peter was showing me, that's the same year that Chicago burned down. And it was also the same year Holland, Michigan burned down. So Chicago had their Great Fire in 1871. Holland had a Great Fire in 1871. The book that Peter was showing me, Michigan on Fire, talked about this Great Fire in 1871. So I'm discovering that there was this great fire all over the Midwest and Michigan and Chicago. Fires were happening all over. And if you think about it, the Homestead Act happened in 1863, so everyone moved in to claim the land. They timbered it, cut all the timbers down, and that's just about the right timing for everything to be dry. And then that's just about the right timing for everything to be dried out, and then the fires start. Peter begins. Even the railroads would ignite, meaning the railroads would start the forest fires. Because sparks from the steam tracks and coal burners, accidental forest fires were often ignited. People were very careless. They didn't just take a cigar and throw it out on the railroad car while they were traveling. When they were cutting a tree down, they had a tendency to throw cigarette butts out or emptied out a pipe. These ashes could be burning for 2 to 3 hours before anything shows. But with all them old leaves that were 100, 200, 300 years old, you see, they used to lumber year-round. And in the summer months, that is like kindling, you know, and away the fire went. They didn't care. There was all kinds of timber. But anyhow, back to this 860. Peter's talking about his 160 acres. Ole Hawkins first sold the back half, 80 acres. What Ole Hawkins is the name of the guy that bought the property across the street from his property now, and this is back in the 1860s. What year did he? Then I go on and ask Peter, what year did he? Did he come and homestead in 1860? Peter says, 1864, about. President Hayes signed the Homestead Act, and we still have that paper. Is Pat Hawkins related to you? No. I could look it up, but the deed is in the safe. I'd have to find it. Yep, the only thing is really wrong with it is some kids got a hold of it someplace, and the state of Michigan stamp that was there, they cut it like this, diagramming the damage that the children were responsible for. Even though you had the sticker, it was cut. You know, it is not a historical. You can tape tape it on, you can glue it or whatever, but you leave it. Anyhow, for some reason it was cut in two. So Peter he goes off on all these kind of random comments. He's about 80 years old when I'm interviewing him. So I'm going to go on. Peter goes on and says, he, Pat Hawkins, sold the 80 acres. What difference did it make? He wasn't farming. He was just lumbering. Then he cut this in two. This 40 was sold to Ole Larson. He was a timberman. And this 40 was sold to I don't know if she was a widow at the time, but she became a widow and went to Minnesota to homestead. So she sold this 40 first to Grandpa. Then he bought this 40, and then he bought back the 80, and it became 160 acres. Again, it became an original homestead, which it is now. Now, across the road where my brother lives, Hawkins his brother had a homestead there, which is right here. The homestead went just behind the barn a square half mile. Well, Rikas had the other homestead here. Here is a general area. When he says here, he means the general area surrounding his farm. And when they were dividing the farm up between the last two boys, he bought a 40 here. When he divided 160 plus 40 he bought equals 200. Divided by 2 is 100. So they each had 100 acres. That is why over here turns to be 120. And then they had sold 10 acres off here. So it is only 110. This is sold off here on the hill. Peter points out the window to the hillside. They sold that 40, which you can see that barn. But what I marvel at is how this got to be back all together. Back as an original 160 acres. The property that he owns was all divided up. The property that Peter owns was all divided up through the years, and eventually it all came back together to be one again, which is unusual to have happen. You know, this 40 acres here probably is not for sale, or somebody could have built a house on it. Same thing with this back 80. The guy could have said, well, I'll sell you 40, but I'm going to keep the other 40. I mean, such things happen, but Grandpa probably talked him into it. Let's buy the whole thing. So it became cleared to him. But it was only cleared about like this. Then Peter starts drawing a diagram. See? This is all woods. And then there is a wedge here that is all woods. And in between here is 100 acres of farmland. At one time I could plow 100 acres. But now with cherries, you're not going to. But in this area here, there is 100 acres. So there has to be at least 110. Because a farmyard takes about 10 acres. And you lose about 4 acres because of the road that's here. And believe it or not, this farm also has a road right here. A public road right here. It hasn't been used for 50 years, but it is there. It has never been closed. You see, it goes into this farm because the blacktop road for a quarter mile, almost half a mile, almost half a mile. Okay, then I say, my bearings are kind of messed up here. Where is your house from here? I'm looking at this diagram that Peter's pointing, trying to describe the property. You're sitting right here. The house is right here. Peter continues to diagram. Okay, and that is County Road 637. And it just misses our farm and makes a circle like that. And this road keeps on going. But there used to be a road right there. Right along the wood line? Well, down right here is along the wood line, but then it goes in the woods because there is a little patch of woods on the neighbors. Yeah, there's a little patch of woods here. So when I say woods is mine, 99% of it is, but there's a little patch of woods here. So actually here is the woods. This is where it should be, not here. That is north. This is south. Just the way you're sitting, that is north. Well, does your brother live in a Centennial farm as well? I guess that is what confuses me. Well, it could be mighty soon because that will be a Centennial farm 16 years later than this one, and this one is 1889. Add 16 to it. So, what was the name of your grandfather? Wenzel? Mm-hmm. Wenzel Korson? Yeah. And was he married? He married Sedilak. What was her name? Mary? Mary? Mary Sedilak. And what was your father's name? Wenzel. And I have a son, Wenzel. It's kind of a bovine name. Every family, according to Dad, almost has to have a Wenzel. Mary, Joe, and a Catherine. If they had 2 boys and 2 girls, you could rest assured those were the names. Wenzel, a Joe, a Mary, and a Kathleen. We could have had the books of records if Dad was not so bullheaded. Grandpa's name was Wenzel Korson. Dad's was Wenzel Korson. Mother wanted to be a Wenzel, but Dad was just not going to have it, a Wenzel. Catherine? Yet there are not too many Catherines out there, but there were. Well, you couldn't hardly find a family that didn't have a Wenzel. Just like, to sort them out, my son's name is Wenzel T. The reason he is Wenzel T is because there was a Wenzel T. Kalchik. There were 3 Wenzel Kalchiks, even though they were in 2 generations, like 2 brothers and a nephew. And that Wenzel went by Wenzel T. That way you sorted him out. That he belonged there. He wasn't part of them, but it was almost that you had to have this. My generation, the name almost dies. Grandpa didn't have a grandson named Wenzel. Dad had 10 girls and 3 boys. There was no reason that you couldn't name one Wenzel, because there weren't one. I don't know. They had Philip and Steve and Dennis in mind, rather than a Wenzel. It really wasn't that bad an idea. Peter tries to explain why his father did not choose the family name of Wenzel in naming one. Okay, I lose page 8. I can't find page 8, so we're gonna skip page 8. Hopefully there's nothing too earth-shattering that was on. Oh wait, maybe this is it. Nope. Okay. So on page 9. That is like my grandpa. He became a citizen when he was about 18, and it was kind of a rigmarole. See, another thing, Bohemian names spelled in Bohemian are spelled different than the same word spelled in English, like Wenzel. Wenzel or Wenzel. But that is an English name for it. I don't know how in the hell you spell it. Peter didn't know how to spell Wenzel in Czechoslovakian. So he had to change his name to this name. Peter had to change the Czechoslovakian pronunciation of his son's name to English. This would have been impossible because the languages do not match. Therefore, Wenzel was chosen as the English version of the Czech name. We had a neighbor by the name of Joe Reika. He had to go to Leelanau and prove that these 2 people are the same person, so he could get a citizenship. It would have been nice. I would have liked to live in that day, all the logging and doing things with horses. There was a big mill in Lake Leelanau. There was 2 mills in Sutton's Bay. There was a mill in Omina, and there was a couple of them in Northport. Have you ever wondered why Gill's Pier is called Gill's Pier? How did your grandfather end up in Leelanau County? Right after the Civil War. See, there also was a war in Czechoslovakia. It was not a real war, but you were always in hazardous duty. Let's put it that way. Like McCoy's in whatever, hillbilly land. You always hear about them shooting at each other. Czechoslovakia was similar to it. They were fighting over each other's property. Better land, better jobs, factories, and whatever. You never knew what side you were on because you never knew what side was winning. So there was a big exodus out of Czechoslovakia in 1864. That is, frankly, when the war was over here, the American Civil War. Actually, I don't think it was over until about 1866. What did you speak? Czechoslovakian? Yeah, Bohunk, Czech. Well, I did not know a word of English when I was starting school. We walked into a county school just like anyone else, like you would have had to walk to. Do you still know it? Well, it takes being away from it for like 70 years. I will give you a little history. I ran into a check at Cherry Growers. Cherry Growers is a fruit receiving and processing plant who worked with George McManus, a former state representative, hauling cherries. And he was jabbering with someone else. And I finally walked up to him and asked, "What part of Germany are you from?" Because he had a little slang. And he says, "I'm a Czech." So we used to jabber. But the thing is, let's go back to when I started school and then come back to this story. I did not know a word of English. So even though Mrs. Flushka was a bohunk and could read and could teach Bohemian just as well as I could, she taught in English. This is America. We're English-speaking people. We teach in English. This is America. None of this foolishness that them Spaniards have. Oh, me no, si, me no, me no. I don't understand. You don't want to. When Mrs. Flushko would give us an assignment, I had to run to the back of the room. You know, you sat in school on the size of pews. The little desks were in front, and then they got bigger and bigger and bigger and bigger, the way the kids were. And if you were a big kid in the second grade, you probably had to sit with the fourth graders to get a desk that you could get your knees under. Well, anyhow, I had to run back to my brother John and ask him, "Just what did she say?" And then he would tell me in English, because he was already a fourth grader. He had to talk English to be in school. And I would go back and I would understand the assignment. But you remember a word. Even if that word is as simple as English. The next time she mentions the word English, you knew that's what it was. Now when we would go home, now this you're going to laugh at, because we were Bohemian speaking people. We talked Bohemian at home, or Czech, or whatever you want to call it. You would start a sentence in Bohemian, then jump up here and talk 2 or 3 words in English words. Jump back down to Bohemian, and then back up to English. It was almost funny because it was whatever came easier to your mind. And that went on for 2 or 3 years because we knew enough English and quit speaking Bohemian that we talked all English. Now take like my brother and sister who are 3 and 4 years younger than me. They don't know any Bohemian because we quit speaking it in the house. It was just something that came. It was not anything that was. Now Dad didn't say, "Well, now we're English. Well, it wasn't anything that was. Now Dad didn't say, "Well, now we're learning English." You just quit because it was easier to rattle it off in English. So you lost your Bohemian words. So since probably 10 years old, we haven't really associated Slovakian lyric. So back to this. Now let's go to Czech, referring to the man Peter met at the fruit processing plant. He would talk to me, and because I'm away for like 70 years, I'm 78. I had to think, I would be talking with him. I would be driving home in the truck after speaking with this man. And boom, there it is, because you have to. Bohemian is a funny language. It doesn't have any English. Go, when, and gone. The word is where it is sitting in the conversation or in the sentence, unless you take the word eating. In English, we would say, "He's eating," "We'll eat," or he is hungry. But in Bohemian, you know what he is doing by where it's sitting in the sentence. See, it's a crazy language. Back to this kid that was asking if he was German, because they are side by side. The Czechs and the Germans, the Czechs and the Polacks. You know that they threw a lot of slang back and forth, just like these Mexicans. They don't speak Spanish. They speak whatever their neighborhoods are talking. I mean, Spaniards in Spain couldn't understand them. Well, it is the same thing if you are next to Germany and you are a Czech. Intermarry, interjobs, intertravel, and whatever. and you keep throwing in slang words as you go. Czech might have half their language, and half of the Germans on board might have Czech names. But anyway, right in that era, that is when a pile of them foreigners came over here. That is why we have a Norwegian settlement that came over here at a similar time. Those are all Norwegians. When you go over there to Solom Road, Nelson Road, Johnson Road. My grandpa was born in Norway and came to America after World War II. He said Leelanau County reminded him of Norway. I know, but he had to have a son name, Spork. Well, that is probably all in between, like all over here. Back off that hill are all the Swedes. Those are Sen, Nelson. Even though there is a Nelson here, there's a Nelson there. Sen. That is how you tell the difference between Norwegians and Swedes. Then over here are the Bohunks, Czechs, Bohunk, whatever you want to call them. They were actually from Czechoslovakia in this area. What about the Bartenhagens? They're Germans, but see, they're clannish. When they came from Old Country, where they were clannish, you will see that every house has a corral, a stone corral or a steel fence. I don't know if you had ancient, modern, or European history. It wasn't always that peaceful. There was always Edward the Great and Napoleon. They were used to wars. They have always been in wars. So you are brought up with the fear of another war. It was just part of life. So they had to conjugate. Over there, you don't find a lone house. You can't go in the middle of 40 acres and find someone living there. Everybody lived in town for protection. They don't need it now. But way back then, you had swords and helmets and daggers and bow and arrows. You had to have some protection because if you had a longhouse, anybody could go and slit your wife's throat, take you as a slave, gut you, or whatever they wanted to do. So everybody lives in town. I'm trying to impress the fact that the reason for these little huts is that they brought it with them. Safety in numbers. Did they come together from Europe, or did they meet each other once they got here and then found their clan? Well, each of these happened because a boat comes over here and finds a place where they homestead. Then they write back and more come. My grandpa could have come. Let's just say Rika, Joe Rika was Peter's neighbor, was first over here. Well, he writes back and says, we're here in Michigan. Such beautiful land and all this free timber. And then some more come and homestead. And finally, you get intermingling nationalities. Like over the hill was Wenzel Selchik. He is Bohunk, but he was in a German settlement. You finally have to get borders close by, and just like going that way. Peter points out the window so that Peter means by saying going that way refers to leaving. Peter's farm and going in the direction of the farms just lying beyond his property. Farms that were once owned by Rikas and Nelsons. Joe Rika boarded Nelson. You can't just have a no man's land in between. We had Henry Kalchik living right in the middle of the Swede settlement. You have to, because of the land. You just happen to be there. You intermingle. But I know my wife can't understand it, but that is a kick. Then there's two. Two farmers who lived in close proximity to settlers or clans that did not openly welcome people from different ethnicities. You're looking at it. This is also a Catholic community, and for some reason people are afraid of Catholics. I don't know why. As if they're going to be dagger throwers or bow and arrow shooters, and over there you've got the Lutherans, or should I say Methodists, because that is what they are now. Over the hill, these Germans are Lutherans, most. I didn't say all, most. Then most here are the Swedes and Methodists. And since you are a Catholic, you are an outcast. I mean, those Catholics, you've got to watch them, or they'll get you. Peter is trying to emulate a stereotype from the past by talking as if he was that person. You were brought up from early on to stay in your neighborhood. You didn't talk to Lutherans if you didn't have to. You didn't talk to Methodists if you didn't have to. Take Dad's generation, even my generation. You couldn't go to the Norwegian settlement and get a conversation going. It was impossible. I am talking about so much segregation, afraid of each other, afraid that someone might do something against the other neighbor. It's just that they're brought up with that. We got to take care of our own. They never let go that the neighbor might be in the same fix. Now, in my generation, I could name you a name, but I won't. I worked with one of the girls just down the road there at Essex. Essex is a factory in Traverse City where Peter once worked. When her dad was a kid, I would have been shot. A Catholic talking to a Methodist? What is this? Are you going to try to change the world? I mean, they were afraid of each other, afraid that something might happen just because you held her hand. Oh my God, you couldn't do any worse. You could slit her throat and that would be okay, but hold her hand, oh my God. Why? He's getting chummy with my neighbor? I mean, there was a regular line. I could name you names, but I won't. I always was, and still do, a lot of work for other people. I have never used religion against anybody. Wherever you want to go to church, that's strictly between you and God or whatever. Just tell me what you want done. Here is your bill. Pay me if you can. I can name you people that would not hire a Catholic, even if you got to go without. And I can name you Catholics that would not hire a Lutheran. They'd go without because that is the way they were fetched up. You don't dare give that neighbor a little chance of being anything. There was a line in the sand, but that's all changed. It could have been that war that changed it. They needed each other. The young folks went to the service. There was just old folks left. There was not enough old folks too, like thrashing, where you need 5 or 6 people. There wasn't enough people to thrash, so you had to go. So you call your neighbor, who you hadn't talked to in 10 years, and ask him if he wanted to work together. See? So some of that congeniality started. But take, for instance, I took 3 months off work one year because they wanted voluntary layoffs. I was Dyson down below the hill. A person from the Norwegian settlement stopped with his daughter. They came up over the hill and stopped to talk to me. Well, about 50 years ago, he would have been shot when he got home. What is this? Talking to that outcast.